Hi, and welcome to Cujo Sound. Bjørn Jacobsen speaking here, and I would like to create some new game audio talk videos here, as I've found 3 quite similar games. Surely they're not the same, but the main setting definitely is. I'm talking about Stranded Deep, Subnautica, and The Forest. And in this video, I'll talk about Subnautica. If you haven't watched the previous video about Stranded Deep, consider doing so, as the whole point here is to talk and analyze about these 3 games on a single hand, and then finally debate them all in common and make a commentary video about how they work and how they have different solutions and so on. Before I get started, I would like to bring the usual disclaimer here that these videos will contain spoilers. They're not made to mock the developer of the game, not to make any kind of disrespect, not meant to find bugs and point fingers at the responsible developers, no. These videos are made to discuss the audio design of the game at hand, the implementation, the issues that we experience while playing, why we may be experiencing these issues, and if I purposely find an issue and force it to happen again, then it's for a reason and not to simply prove that there's a bug here. But let's get to it and talk about Subnautica. Subnautica is a game just like the other 2 in the series where we find ourselves crash-landed on a remote planet. Different from the 2 other games, then this is on an actual planet and not some remote place that could be considered on Earth. Subnautica is mainly taking place underwater, hence there's a lot of underwater ambience. Distant whale sounds and the usually muffled drone sounds to make it sound like it's underwater, it's all there. Different from Stranded Deep here is that Stranded Deep, when underwater, you're basically in immediate danger. Whereas here, the main point and part of this game is that you are underwater, so it's your main ground to be in. That also comes through with the sound in the other games, because underwater is unpleasant and dangerous, but in Subnautica, it's more aesthetically pleasing and a better experience when you're under the surface. Personally, I don't think it's that good, but that is mainly because a lot of the time, everything here in Subnautica is based on loops, meaning that the patterns that we hear in the ambient drone loops occur over and over again, and sometimes even within minutes, or even playthroughs between, they are recognizable patterns, and we'll get to those. But I have to point out as well here that a lot of the sound bugs that occur in Subnautica are actually not sound bugs. It's more like gameplay bugs and loading areas where the sound is the first thing you notice to be faulty. But actually it's simply because the game loads weirdly, like when you come out of the water. There's a slight delay before the splash occurs. Doing so several times is definitely possible, and you can 100% reproduce this. But this is definitely because the hook to which the sound is dependent on is triggering oddly, and not the sound itself. You may also notice that when you're starting up the game and loading the levels again, sometimes during the loading scene you will get various audio cues, meaning that those are hooked up to when an object loads and not necessarily to when you need to hear it.
Warning, emergency power only, oxygen production offline.
The loading of things triggering audio also becomes apparent when loading your save game, as it plays various sounds and triggers during the load. So objects with sound triggers on them is definitely loaded and triggered instantly instead of being kept silent during the loading scene. And the only reason we know so is because the audio does tell us. So quite often this would be misinterpreted as an audio bug, while it should be labeled as code or game design because we don't want these objects to load at all during the loading scene. Or at least not in the visible gameplay area. Unless, of course, it was up to the sound designers to tell all these things to be muted during the load, we will never know. Also, when you surface, you sometimes get very clear underwater sounds that are still playing once you have even surfaced. And that's one of the things that really made me wonder now and then, because if this sound is meant to be heard here, above the water, that's fine, but to me it sounds like that this is an underwater sound that is simply playing wrong, or it's not stopping from playing an underwater trigger when exiting the water. The map in Subnautica, different from Stranded Deep, is always the same. meaning that areas can be mapped in volumes or colliders as they're called in Unity. This particularly shows when you run around near caves or islands where it's possible to cross the border of these volumes and colliders at unexpected places, making the reverberation of this cave and the ambience of the cave quite obvious.
Seek fluid intake.
Here, when I jump out of the cave zone, the reverb disappears and the cave ambience does so as well, but it comes back once I'm into the collider while I'm clearly outside of the cave. Also here, where I'm clearly outside of the cave, but the reverb and the cave ambience is still playing, and as I jump into the water here, it only goes away when I'm halfway down. And now we die. Yep. Another thing with reverb is that regardless of when you pick up something like limestones or other deposits of materials underwater, they seem to have an indoor reverb. Most likely baked to them, but why is there a reverb sound underwater? From a personal perspective, I don't think the material sweetener really fits the soundscape, like breaking the stone, gathering material, and then this almost fantasy-style 2D bling-bling putting sound pops up. Actually, that is my greatest concern with everything in this game. I like the setting, I like the sound design overall, but the sound design definitely has also moments where I'm really wondering who set up the aesthetics and the direction of this, and was there ever even a playthrough where they decided that maybe this sound should be changed?
30 seconds.
I like the drony music. It really sets a nice mood. I did hear from others though that they thought it had too little variation and the tracks would occur too often. But despite that, I really think the music has some nice elements to it. Coming from old trance, techno, glitchy IDM style background myself, I think some of these tracks are pretty good actually. I like the glitchy stuff they have. You do get equipment from time to time in the game, and that quite stereotypically pitches up and down as the speed of the equipment does. A typical start sound, a loop sound, and a stop sound. With this little handheld device, it's pretty nice and accurate. Yet when you enter this Seamoth submarine here, it becomes rather apparent that the start sound plays whenever you're at a certain speed, continues to do so even if you stop, and then trigger again after a certain amount of time, which can make for some odd moments if you start stop this Seamoth constantly. So if you're moving after having started the startup sound, it won't trigger. But it does once you're completely still again, so clearly a start sound, a pitch loop, and it pitches down when stopping again. The sounds are not bad, just could have used a little polish here. One thing that I did really like when playing the game is this thing here. Entering your escape pod or habitat sound, you really hear very nice dripping on the floor very nicely. Like really sounds like you're coming from a wet area and you're coming into a dry area, and this is splattering all over the floor. Exiting the escape pod here does sound a little different. but I also noticed later that when doing this from the habitat, the game doesn't seem to know if I'm moving from outdoors to indoors or from indoors to outdoors. Or not really from indoor to outdoor, it's more like indoor to outwater. As you also have these dripping sounds when going out into the water again, with reverb and the whole thing in there, which is quite uncanny. Seems more like a glitch actually, because I have seen videos online where this doesn't happen. Also, I've tried playing the game in a different habitat where this doesn't occur. Actually, I found out that this doesn't happen, like I just said, in my other habitat, so I'm wondering why this happened. This specific exit where this happens is actually right underneath my escape pod. Could it be because it thinks that the above escape pod is actually a ceiling? And then having a ray that points upwards and simply says we're still indoors just because there is something blocking? So is the system of indoor-outdoor really determined by if there is something above us like this? That's fairly interesting, actually. Another thing, as mentioned before with the reverb and that, is the footsteps, which seems to have extremely few variations. Also, I noticed a rather odd click sound on every step. Which only seems to be there indoors, and outdoors it's not, and then there's a lot of variation in the loop that plays the Foley on top. So really nice sweeteners when walking outside, but not when inside. Someone on Steam mentioned that this was probably your gear clicking when walking, but the odd part is that when outside, it really sounds like a layer of Foley on top of your walking cycles, which is pretty good. But indoors, it's the same click over and over again. We know it's not baked into the reverb because it does happen depending on material and not depending on being indoor and outdoor. But the sound does occur mostly indoors, or at least the harder materials indoor. This happens regardless of what indoor space you're in, be it a habitat, massive alien structure, cave, etc. But once outdoors, you can hear the footsteps pretty clearly, and then seemingly random-triggered Foley loop on top, which is a nice way to deal with it. It's just kind of weird that it's so inconsistent. Another thing here is running and walking sounds really different from one another when changing from one to the other. Yet, same looking material, the steps are very different. This is walking, and this is running. Also, footsteps definitely trigger on cycle and not necessarily on animation, as it is possible to walk into shallow water like this and actually swim, but the game still thinks that we're walking. As a final remark, I'd like to touch upon patterns and the basic ambiances here, as one of the things I've noticed when playing the game, and this goes well with what I said before, that it seems like they're really lacking direction, or someone going through the game and having a director's perspective and aesthetics, thinking about what should be changed, and having like a red thread between all the tracks. This beeping sound here in the background of the underwater sounds, to me it sounds like a truck backing up. Sure, these sounds must be there for a reason, else they wouldn't be put there, but then the reason just isn't very obvious. Thus, the reference in my head is at least to something completely unrelated, in this case, to trucks. It is not super unrealistic to believe that this background sound was actually made from a city soundscape, pitched and glitched and sauced and reverb and other things to become the drone in this soundscape, and that's a very nice way to create soundscapes and drones. My main issue with this is that it creates a sound that I can remember. I don't care what source material you use, but once you have a pattern and it becomes clear to you that this is played over and over again, while you play, only think of, oh, it's that sound again. Also, some of the fish and monsters, sure, some of them have great sounds on their own, but all combined, I think it sounds like two different games sometimes. Some of the fish sound like glitchy random sounds, which is great. Some of them sound like people laughing. Some like typical monsters, almost too clean sound, actually. Next to everything else with reverb and it's underwater. But that's also great, but in context with one another, it just doesn't seem to fit much. Thirdly, a lot of sounds in the whole game sound like they're coming straight out of a modular synth. Nothing wrong with coming out of a modular synth, but again, it's combined with the other sounds. It's like 3 or more different soundscapes just mashed together. A little red thread and connection in between would have really been perfect. The individual sounds are awesome, I gotta say that, but let's leave it there, right? All in all, I think Subnautica has some great sounding moments, maybe great sounds. They're all out of context and great on their own. Together, I don't think so. I would have loved to have worked on this game. Like, underwater games like these are probably the dream of most sound designers, as you can probably imagine. Simply because the game has so many elements that are nice to sound design. Monsters, underwater, alien structures, impacts, machine movements, and so on. Must have been a real blast to create all this, and yeah, once outside and in the open and no music, the ambience is quite nice. The random spawning sounds of the nearby creatures all works really well. Most of the time. Let's move on to playing the forest in the next video and see what we can come up with of goodies in that game, and if there's anything we can discuss. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, and if you want to know more about game audio and the videos I create here, then subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I would really appreciate it if you want to support the channel. You can head over to patreon.com/Cujo Sound, where you for as little as $1 a month can help me sustain this channel and all the time I have to take off to create all this content. You can even sign up for greater tiers if you need help or want help, mentorships and other things. And we have a nice community Discord going on as well that you can become a member of. Hopefully you learned something from watching this, and hopefully I will see you again in one of the future videos. Have an excellent day. This is Bjørn Jacobsen of Cujo Sound, signing out. Ta-ta.